In class, we looked at some of the arguments for defending the position that Paul is the author of the Pastoral Epistles, and we have begun to look at some of the arguments that have been used to defend the view that the Apostle Paul is not the actual writer of these letters. I had done a few comments about what some of those arguments are, but here in this video, I want to complete some of those arguments for you to consider. So one of the first things as well we want to take a look at here is it is difficult to find a place for the pastorals, the composition, in the portion of Paul's life that is known to us from the book of Acts or even from the letters of Paul that are not questions. So things like the book of Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Philippians. So some of these books are not really questioned that the Apostle Paul is the author of them. And so trying to trace what his activities were like and travels, it's difficult to see when these things that are presupposed by the pastoral epistles could have taken place. As far as the book of Acts is concerned, Paul is left, as it were, in confinement in Rome. But the pastoral epistles seem to indicate that Paul had an evangelistic activity on the island of Crete, which is not recorded in Acts and is not hinted at all in the Pauline epistles. And then as well, we have the situation for 1 Timothy, where Paul has left Timothy in Ephesus and has gone into Macedonia. Again, this kind of scenario doesn't square with anything that we have in the book of Acts, or is there any indication of this taking place in these other letters by Paul? So for that reason, many scholars do not think that Paul was the actual one who wrote this, but someone has kind of created, as it were, a scenario in which Paul would have left Timothy, or Paul would have evangelized on Crete. But there was a tradition that developed that what the book of Acts tells us is that Paul was in confinement under house arrest, but that he was released. He was not found guilty of any crime against the state. And that he did go on to Spain, and then he came back to the island of Crete and evangelized there with Titus, and left Titus there and went on to Ephesus and was there with Timothy, and then went on up into Macedonia, having left Timothy in Ephesus, and he moves on until he's arrested a second time, and then taken back to Rome, and this time was found guilty and was executed. So that's an argument, though, against the authorship. One of the strong ones that is oftentimes cited is that the pastorals are full of new vocabulary. And so that is one of the things. It has the largest percentage of new words of any of Paul's writings. And so that has to be accounted for. Why are there these new words? And of course, there are different theories about why this is the case. One is that we're dealing with a different author who uses a different vocabulary than what Paul did. But others who want to still defend Pauline authorship for the letters will say, well, Paul is just using the vernacular. He's just using the language that would have been common amongst Timothy and his audience in Ephesus. Of course, one must then wonder, well, why doesn't the same kind of language show up in the letter to the Ephesians, which of course is also questioned whether or not it was written by Paul, and it too has some new concepts or ideas. So, but it is recognizing well that some of these words that occur in the pastorals are words we do find in the writings of Christians in the early part of the 2nd century. So, kind of connecting this new vocabulary with the writings of Christians in the early 2nd century um, gives support to those who want to claim that Paul did not compose these letters. Some vocabulary, such as the word Savior, the way in which the word appearance is used, seems to especially reflect technical terms, which was used for the Hellenistic cults, especially the cult of the ruler, since the ruler, the emperor, is Savior. And this idea of appearance, the appearing of Jesus, also kind of reflect the idea of the appearing of the emperor, or the birth of the emperor, the arrival of the emperor upon the scene in order to rule. So again, this is some of that evidence that's used. The author also uses vernacular, that is common designations, instead of kind of the original Pauline word. So he uses this language such as good conscience, or to be sound, this phrase to be sound, sound teaching. That's unique to the pastoral epistles. Also, this idea of the grace that brings salvation. So these are not ways in which we find Paul talking in the other letters. But again, someone might be able to say, well, he's just picked up the way in which people are talking and has been influenced by that. Or someone might say, well, maybe it's not Paul himself who has penned the letters, but he has used a like a secretary in order to write this, and this secretary uses these words that are common to him in order to express the basic idea of what Paul is trying to get across. So this is a evidence of something that has to be accounted for in some way, and so the different theories have existed on both sides. Finally, we're going to just look here at a couple of other issues against Pauline authorship. There is this concern for church organization that some have claimed belongs more to the time of the 2nd century. Having overseers, in other words, organizing the church in a way so that it maintains a kind of stability or continuity after the death of the apostles. I'm not so much convinced by this argument. I do see Paul concerned to have elders in churches, at least as far as we can see from the book of Acts and his missionary activities, or we see in the book of Philippians when he recognizes overseers or elders. Why Paul couldn't be concerned with organization earlier on in his life, I'm not really quite sure why that couldn't be the case. But it is the case that there is an interest in church organization from the 2nd century onward, and that the pastoral epistles does fit that concern. But I'm not sure that such a concern could not have existed. It seems quite natural to me that a concern for organization would be present when one has formed a community of believers. But unlike the uniform presentation of regulations in the Didache, so the Didache is a early Christian writing, maybe late 1st century, maybe early 2nd century, which gives kind of instructions or rules about how to behave. But it's very uniformed in its presentation. The literary structure of 1 Timothy looks more like a collection of various materials. So that's why it may seem like Paul in 1 Timothy is jumping from one subject to the next. As you kind of look at the breakup of chapters, oftentimes it just seems to make a quick switch to another topic. And so for some, that is evidence that what we have in the letter like 1 Timothy is a collection of teachings that someone has now kind of composed. Were these collections of teachings of Paul? Were they collections of teachings from a disciple of Paul. Again, nobody would know for certain that, but this says more about what the text looks like in terms of its structure, its composition. So anyway, we will end it with that. And those are just some of the arguments that we didn't get to discuss in class, but I wanted to make sure that you had them for your examination.